Pardon me. Didn't see you there. My name is Professor Nguyen, and I'll be teaching you Africana Studies today. Before we get started with the material, I just want to give you a quick rundown on how I would like to do things. Now, I don't have any PowerPoints, no writing, no reading, no books, no long textbooks, none of that boring stuff. We're just going to have a conversation. I think that's the best way to retain material. So instead of going through a long presentation on a PowerPoint while you'll be dozing off, reading through a textbook, showing you boring things, just think about it as a conversation between you and I. That's the best way to retain the information. Let's get started. Like I said earlier, we're going to be talking about Africana Studies. Today, my first question for you is, what do you think Africana Studies is? What pops up in your head when you hear Africana Studies? Give me your best shot, I'll listen. That's an excellent answer. Let me tell you my opinion on what Africana Studies is. I think, personally, that Africana Studies is the study of Africa. I know that sounds so simple, but it's the study of Africa. Past, present, and future. Ancient civilizations, today we're going to be talking about Nubia, civilizations that exist today, and future Africa. It can be a history lesson, geography lesson, social psychology lesson. It's such a broad topic that many subjects come into play. Now, today, it's going to be more of a history lesson, but when we talk about Africana Studies, it's the study of Africa. Now, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown on Africana Studies. It began in the 60s. Students protested at schools, actually, to have it in their curriculum because they wanted to learn more about Africana Studies. The thing was that schools had trouble teaching Africana Studies because, like I said, it was such a broad topic. There's so much information that people really had a hard time pinpointing on what they really wanted to focus on. So that's why there was a lack of Africana Studies back then. But like I said, students protested to schools, and eventually in the late 1960s got Africana Studies to begin rolling. Now, my second question to you would be, why do you think we need Africana Studies today? What's so important about Africana Studies that we can apply it to everyday life today? I'll give you a quick second and you get back to me. That's a great answer. Let me tell you why I think we need Africana Studies today in our curriculum. I'm just going to read you a quick quote by John Reynolds, a little snippet about Africana Studies. He says, most students are more likely to think Africa in terms of tribes or Stone Age rather than a continent with diversity and changing civilizations. What's the problem with that? I'll tell you the problem with that. We are so ignorant on many things in the world, and one of them is the history of Africa. Many history books have been erased or written in favor of the European side, so we don't get both sides. So when we don't get both sides, it's clearly biased and inaccurate information. So because we get so much inaccurate information about Africa, we create all these stereotypes that could potentially hurt people of these cultures because we are so ignorant to the fact of how their culture really is or was. And in order to combat this, we need to educate ourselves and others on how Africa really was and how it is today. Some problematic views that we create, stereotypes in other words, would be that Africa is still primitive, that everybody is still walking around with spears and stones, hunting animals, and that's how they get their food. Yeah, sure, there might be a few people that hunt the traditional way or an old-fashioned way, but a lot of Africa is actually industrialized and keeping up technology with the rest of the world. Um, Another problematic view would be that Africa is this utopia, that everybody is holding hands, singing kumbaya, um, that everything is so blissful, you know? Um, when in actuality, there's a lot of warfare and conflict going on in Africa, just like any other country that's going through problems. And we can blame this on the media. The media has probably the most profound effect on any of us throughout our whole lives. And when you see Africa in movies or in cartoons, it's usually depicted, as I said, as a utopia or a very primitive um, Africa. Um, the way we see things on TV is going to influence our thoughts on Africa. And I know I said this earlier, but I just wanted to reinstate this again for you guys that in order to get rid of these stereotypes or to combat them, we need to educate ourselves. After we educate ourselves, we need to educate others. Education is the key to breaking down these stereotypes because stereotypes skew our worldview and how the world actually is and was. So we're going to dive into Nubia a little bit right now. It's going to be real quick, but I hope it gives you a lot of information. Nubia was a ancient civilization of Africa which now exists in modern-day Sudan near the Egypt border. Um, it existed about 6 to 7,000 years ago, so about 3100 BC. Not too many people knew about Nubia until recently in the 1970s, early 1980s, that some artifacts were found, and archaeologists began traveling to Africa to unravel more of leftover artifacts to study what was left from Nubia. So, the reason Nubia is this mysterious ancient civilization that no one knows about, and the only thing we know about them is the few artifacts that we find or the few monuments and structures that they have left, is because it was overshadowed by Egypt. Egypt had its own writing system, which everyone knows is hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics are the small symbols or little drawings that Egypt used for its form of writing. Nubia, however, did not have a form of writing. Therefore, we can't really tell much about Nubia. We don't have too much accurate information. The only accurate information we have closest about Nubia would be from the Egyptian writing hieroglyphics. Now, I have another question for you. Do you see how problematic it can be for Nubia's whole history and existence to be in hieroglyphic language, which is an Egyptian form of writing? You guessed it. Inaccurate information and biased information. As we spoke earlier about it, this also applies right here. Egypt actually ruled over Nubia, and in the hieroglyphics, they depicted Nubians as savages, as untouchables, as slaves pretty much. When they took over Nubia, Egypt took many Nubians and made them slaves or made them wrestle as a form of entertainment and pretty much just used the people and took over their land and all their goods. So with that being said, how accurate do you think this information about Nubia is going to be based on the hieroglyphics? The hieroglyphics were made by people that thought these Nubians were less than them. They thought they were nothing. They used them as slaves. So how do you think the information from these hieroglyphics are going to create stereotypes that are inaccurate? Education and research. What a surprise. Archaeologists began coming to Sudan, modern day Sudan, to um, find artifacts and clues in search of this Nubian um, society. And when they got there, these archaeologists found many clues and many artifacts that supported that Nubia was this thriving economic civilization. They were actually pretty advanced for their time. They had many technologies that helped them communicate, such as rock gongs, which were these little rocks that you hit on a bigger rock, which sounded like a bell, and they would use these to communicate with each other from far away, and that was their another form of communication, which was very advanced. They also found a bunch of rock art which depicted cattle, and with further investigation, they found a whole cemetery full of cattle, about 5,000 cattle around this king's tomb. And they were able to figure out that cattle was used as a form of currency, as a sign of wealth. The more cattle you had, the more wealthier you were. So that's why when the king died, they sacrificed so many cattle to offer him in the next life to ensure that he had whatever he needed in the next life. This also showed that the civilization was so thriving that they could afford to sacrifice 5,000 cows just like that for their king. Because the archaeologists found 5,000 cows or so, they were able to determine that the Nubians were actually a thriving, healthy civilization, and they were not struggling for food at all. Because if you can afford to lose 5,000 cattle just to offer for your king, you must have been doing very well. This showed that they had the resources with farming, food, water, which they were near the Nile River. They had all the resources they needed to survive comfortably. Another interesting artifact that the archaeologists found were that iron was still made today the same way it's made back then, thousands of years ago. So this showed that even though Nubia and its actual existence is gone, their practices, their culture is still seen somewhat today in present day Sudan. So it's interesting to see how thousands of years ago these techniques still influence modern day culture. Now, this does not only apply to Nubia and that civilization in Africa. You can apply this to Chinese culture, European culture. All cultures around the world are influenced by the past. Inevitably, we learned that Nubia was wiped out not because of Egypt, but because of expanding desert conditions. The desert began to grow more and more, and that led to the depletion of grass and drying out of the water, which took away the cattle. And if you don't have cattle, there was no food source. So eventually they were wiped out because of natural causes and not because of the Egyptians. The Egyptians actually only ruled over Nubia for a couple of centuries until Nubia regained their independence. So with that being said, I just want to reiterate the importance of Africana studies. We have to realize that not everything we are told is the truth or the accurate truth. It may be a partial truth, but we must do our own research and educate ourselves on how civilizations were back then. And once we do that, we are able to determine and see how present day is affected. And that's why Africana Studies is so important, because it gives us a deeper knowledge and a true meaning on why Africa is the way it is today and how it operates. When we learn about the past, we know about the future, and we know about the present. I just want to thank you for giving me the time to lecture to you about Africana studies and a little bit about Nubia. I just want to remind you that in order to learn about our present and future, we must learn about our past. I would like to wrap things up with education is the key to breaking down stereotypes.